Welcome to Let's Talk to Animals. My name is Shannon Cutts with animallovelanguages.com. I am an animal sensitive and intuitive and a Reiki master practitioner. And most importantly, mama, parent, for those of you who are familiar, to a very rambunctious, nearly 13-week-old baby cockatiel named Petal. And she's supposed to be co-hosting with me, but there is a crispy, crunchy cardboard egg carton underneath the laptop, and she's got a full-on project going. Let's just say that much and leave it at that, right, my love? So today the topic on the table is highly sensitive pets. What does that mean? How can you tell? Are there certain things that work better for highly sensitive pets and maybe are even necessary for working with training and peacefully cohabitating with highly sensitive pets? And we're also going to take a look at some common myths, like, does high sensitivity really exist in other species besides our own? Of course, Dr. Elaine Aron popularized the highly sensitive person. I am a highly sensitive person. Let me tell you, it really changed my life when I discovered her groundbreaking work. But can the trait of high sensitivity really exist in other species? Another common myth is high sensitivity always a trait that is found with introversion or shyness or social anxiety? So we're going to take a look at some of those myths as well. But this is something that comes up with surprising frequency when I am communicating with my animal clients. And often, some of the behavioral issues that their person is kind of struggling with or wrestling with or trying to work through have been mislabeled or just misunderstood as something else, something other. Maybe there's been an attempt to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of that pet's personality and their behavior and their traits and their way of being together. And it looks good on paper, but it's just not gelling. It's just not really all adding up. There really isn't any significant positive change going on from all the other interventions that have been tried. Examples can be animals that become unusually aggressive in certain situations, or unusually submissive, or unusually absent, like the animal that's always hiding under the bed or in the very back corner of their habitat or their cage, or always wants to go outside. And then we're going to take a look, kind of a brief overview of some things that can help the highly sensitive pet to adapt and adjust and find that buffer against some of the triggers that they're not completely unique to the highly sensitive pet, but they definitely are amplified. So you're listening to someone who is, as I mentioned, a highly sensitive person. And I also care for multiple highly sensitive pets of different species. And I regularly encounter highly sensitive pets in the work that I do as an animal intuitive and an animal communicator and a Reiki practitioner. And often I encounter highly sensitive pet parents as well. So let's just say I'm coming to you with a wealth of not so much formal education and training, but street smarts and lots of on-the-job training and learning. And I truly do hope that this episode will be helpful and enlightening for you and for the animals that you love and care for, and that maybe will help answer some questions that you've been struggling with. Let's get started here. First things first, what's a highly sensitive person? Because this is what we're really the most familiar with. Dr. Elaine Aron's work has really opened up the dialogue to take a look at, what is this trait? Is it advantageous in certain circumstances? Why might we have it? And most importantly for our purposes here, if we, Homo sapiens, have it, then might other species also possess this trait? And if yes, in what proportion to the rest of the general population of that species? So let's look at the highly sensitive person A highly sensitive person is somebody who is naturally more aware of and or reactive to external stimuli. This can be bright lights, it can be loud noises, it can be strong aromas or smells or tastes. It can be large groups of people or even textures, fabrics. For instance, I hate fabric tags. I cut them out immediately when I get a new to me. We do a lot of thrifting in this household, but a new to me item of clothing. It can be even intense emotional experiences like watching certain types of movies or attending certain types of art exhibits or musical performances. It is inborn and innate. So, this is something that we come into our life with. It's genetic, it's heritable, and it affects approximately 20% of our species population. So the Homo sapiens species population, about 20% of us have the trait of high sensitivity. Is it a coping mechanism? Is it part of the trait of high sensitivity? I would say the answer to that is yes on both counts, but it can result in an individual who has a very highly developed empathic ability and also a very highly developed, rich, and complex inner life. That's all part of the trait. It's also part of the balancing act of living in our increasingly noisy and kind of a sensory overload environment. Sensory overload is not just welcomed, it's sought out for so many people. And for us, even just the daily stuff can be sensory overload. So we certainly don't need any extra. We don't need the surround sound. We don't need 4 diffusers in each corner of the room. We don't need the meal with 10 courses and recipes from 4 continents. We're pretty good keeping it simple. Small doses of an experience can go a long way. So, unfortunately, in my species, at least, I can certainly share this from firsthand experience. The trait of high sensitivity tends to be labeled and not typically in a flattering light. When I was little, I was often viewed as antisocial, shy, indrawn. I got used to having people walk by me and yell in my face, smile, and it's not that I wasn't smiling. I just was inside doing my thing. I was contemplating, or I was retreating, or I was recalibrating, or whatever I wasn't even aware of the individuals around me who would take my expressions or lack of expressions personally, and I wasn't even really aware of them. Sometimes I was labeled as difficult to reach or to work with, poker faced, or regularly got used to hearing, "What's wrong with you?" To the point where I really thought I really needed to find it too. What is this thing that's wrong with me? Now, here's what's so interesting. The trait of high sensitivity impacts about 20% of our population and is present in more than 100 other species. And this is just the ones we know about. And in about the same proportion, about 20%. All of the same basic hallmarks apply, where you might see 80% of a population charge at a threat. Maybe the 20% that have the trait of high sensitivity might choose a different method or maybe retreat. An interesting analogy, it's not apples to apples, but it might give you some food for thought. If you haven't watched the movie Divergent with Shailene Woodley, it's a really good glimpse into what it might look like to have the trait of high sensitivity in certain respects, in terms of just tackling problems from a different perspective, or taking an approach that seems at odds with what the rest of the world would naturally and normally do to solve that problem. When you look at her character and you see what she has to go through, and how she has to learn to adapt her way of being to that of the greater population, to avoid sticking out, to avoid potentially causing harm to herself and her family, or even being hunted because she's different. She's different. And yet you also see as the movie unfolds this, and I'm just talking about this first movie here, you see how that trait of hers really comes in handy when there's a crisis. And this is what researchers and scientists believe prompted the development of the highly sensitive trait in the first place. And it makes good sense on every level of my being, because I have found sometimes that I tend to shine in certain crisis situations almost without knowing why or how it's happening or how I do what I do. And it comes so naturally, but it's just I guess my special skills haven't been needed all that much. But when they are, it's really evident. And people will come to me and say, "How did you know to do that?" And I don't know. I just do it. So watching that movie Divergent, the first movie called Divergent, may give you a little bit, if you're someone who is kind of a visual and auditory learner like I am, and you just like to kind of see the trait in action, it might be a good way to kind of wrap your mind around it, or even try it on for size. Perhaps you are also highly sensitive. Perhaps you are caring for a highly sensitive pet, and it can just help to start putting the actual puzzle pieces together. You know, when you've got this puzzle and it's like 90% of it fits, but then, or 80% in this case, but then there's these 20% of these pieces that just don't seem to quite fit together. This may help you make a little bit more sense of it. What does the trait look like in our animals? What is a highly sensitive pet? So the next thing I want to address is actually a common myth. As a highly sensitive person, I mentioned I've often been labeled as shy, indrawn, socially awkward, socially anxious. What's wrong with you? Why don't you smile? I also happen to be introverted. I'm actually quite introverted. I am what is now kind of loosely being called a social extrovert, which means if you throw me into social situations, or if I place myself into a situation where I may be leading something, or maybe I'm throwing a party for someone, it hasn't happened very often, but I've done it a few times, then you're going to probably witness somebody that could easily be mistaken for an extrovert. But really, that's just a lifetime of being on stage, of being in public settings, of playing roles like public speaker, musician. I founded a nonprofit and I led that for a decade. So I've got a lot of training in kind of how to be. If I choose to swim in those waters, I need to bring certain tools in my toolkit with me to make sure that those endeavors are successful, but that doesn't mean that that's the way I prefer it. And so for me personally, I happen to be highly sensitive and I happen to have the trait of introversion. You can be highly sensitive and you can fall anywhere on the spectrum from introversion to extroversion for whatever reason. However, the trait of introversion versus extroversion doesn't really seem to matter when it comes to high sensitivity, and both are needed. Everyone is needed, whether you're highly sensitive or you're not highly sensitive. You can be an empath without having the trait of high sensitivity. You don't have to be highly sensitive to smells and sounds and sights and flavors and textures in order to be highly empathic. Really kind of taking the tapestry and separating everything out into individual threads and recognizing each one of these are separate traits that can combine in any number of ways. So we're not looking at labeling here. We're not looking at going, well, this is better, or that's better. We're not looking at labeling. We're just looking at how this trait can come alongside all of these other different traits and still maintain its sense of itself and still be something separate and apart with its own reason for being. And now that I've kind of given you a little overview of the highly sensitive person, the traits, and how that trait can show up alongside other traits, let's get on to the real stars of our show, our animal companions. What does the trait of high sensitivity look like in our companion animals? First of all, we now know that it exists. It's been documented to a degree in over 100 species, and if it's present in 100, it's likely present in all species to some extent. And this is because it can be adaptively advantageous to have it. And under certain circumstances, it promotes survival of the species. It continues to get passed along from generation to generation. It's part of natural selection doing its job well. When high sensitivity shows up in our animals, however, often it produces some of the same biases against those animals that maybe they're not perceived as being as friendly, maybe they're perceived as being neurotic or inhibited or unusually fearful or aggressive. This tends to lead to trauma. That animal is more challenged, especially if there's a relinquishment or an abandonment along the way somewhere to find a new forever home. They tend to have a little more trouble just kind of going with the flow and easily fitting in when a new animal joins the family, when there's a change in the family situation, when there's a move, when there is a lot going on in the household. And so it can be really tough beyond a certain point to kind of tease apart what's causing what with these animals. And that's where the work that I do, animal communication, can really be helpful because we can bring the animal's perspective to the conversation. We can hear what's going on inside them and start to tease apart the pathways that have formed some of these different maybe coping mechanisms or behaviors that we're seeing that we're really not sure kind of how to deal with, and what's causing what and what's continuing to perpetuate what. This jumping at loud sounds, how much of that is caused by maybe a past trauma or living in a really noisy place or living in a really chaotic household where there were lots of arguments, or living in a situation where there were certain dominant or aggressive humans or animals that were kind of taking advantage of the animal's high sensitivity trait. Then how much is due to just that trait itself, just being inborn and present and functioning exactly as it should? An animal that prefers to kind of get the lay of the land before they engage, prefers to kind of hang out in the doorway for a while and get a sense of the energy and the mood in the room before joining in. That can be highly pro-survival behavior, but when we pair it with trauma and things like that, then it can start to kind of get blown out of proportion. We start to see an animal that just, no matter what they do, no matter what they try to coexist and get along, it doesn't work for them, and or it doesn't work for their people, and or it's just misunderstood, mislabeled, and then the pet parents are trying to fix that animal, and they're constantly engaged in trying to help this animal come out of their little corner or break through that shyness barrier, when really this is just the way that animal is. And I've talked to animals who are they don't really love to be touched. They don't love to be petted all the time. They're not snugglers. And this is just because it's overwhelming to them. And just a little pet on the head is like a full-on body hug to a non-highly sensitive animal, or rather an animal that doesn't possess the genetic trait for high sensitivity. And it's like, well, why don't you love me? Why don't you want to snuggle with me? It's like, well, because it's toxic to me past a certain level. Like I literally can't deal with it, and there's nothing I can do about it. When we start talking with the animal, we start to find out, okay, well, is this a trauma thing? Are you in pain? Or is this a health issue that we can do something about so you can enjoy being cuddly and being snuggly and roughhousing with your brothers and sisters and sitting on our laps at night? Or is this a trait of high sensitivity manifesting? And we need to get on board with that and allow you the space energetically, emotionally, mentally, and physically that you need to feel safe and okay as a member of our family. And sometimes there's really no way of knowing that without actually asking the animal directly. You might wonder, how do I know when I'm talking with an animal? How can I tell? Well, one of the ways I can tell is that I get a lot of physical sensations. I get a lot of emotional sensation. And because I have the trait of high sensitivity, it tends to be easy for animals to convey that information. It almost doesn't need any translation. And that's something I teach in my animal communication classes. Like, how does that translation process really happen when there's data coming in, sensory data coming in from an animal, and then it passes through our right brain, passes through our left brain, it pops out as something that is capable of being shared, usually in the form of images, sounds, memories, song lyrics, movie clips, things or deep knowings that can then be translated into words and become shareable, so I can tell that animal's person what's going on with accuracy and be helpful to that family, to that interspecies family. But because I also have the trait of high sensitivity and I care for highly sensitive animals of various species, it's very easy for animals to share what's going on with them. And because I also have trauma in my background and I have recovery experience, for me, it's been depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. It's pretty easy for me to kind of tease apart what may be coming from trauma or what may be coming from an inborn inherited trait. And then we can also look, I've got some medical intuitive training, and I also tend to I'm just very, very aware on a physical level, on an emotional level, on a mental level. There's just many, many moons, many decades of development in all of these areas. And even on a soul level, is this part of their soul contract, but I can get sensations and be able to provide those so that that animal's person can connect with their vet and just maybe check some things out. There may be multiple levels to whatever's going on with that animal, but this tends to be a sweet spot for me in the sense of my background and training, education, and life experience has led me to be able to have these kinds of conversations with animals with a great amount of ease. I don't know if other communicators find it as easy as I do, but it just happens to be something that I seem to be made for, and that's really awesome. It's always great when we find out where we fit and how we can be of service and how we can be helpful. It's a vital part of not only helping our animals to kind of cope with living in our world by our rules and under the shadow of our expectations for what they should be like. And we may not know. I've cared for a number of animals. I'm 52 right now as I'm recording this. And so I started keeping company with an interspecies family when I was 8. So I certainly have multiple decades of caring for animals of all different shapes and sizes and species and personalities and temperaments and traits. And I can say this with absolute humility and sincerity. I may adopt a new animal and have expectations based on other animals of that species that I've cared for. I may adopt a new turtle or a new dog or a new parrot, and I may expect them to act like all the other animals in their species group. And when they don't, I have to go through this exact same process that I'm talking with you about now. So this is not to shame or guilt or lecture anyone who may be listening to this who's suddenly realizing, oh man, I just expected my dog or my cat or my parrot or my reptile or my horse to behave a certain way, because that's what I've always known and that's what I've experienced from other animals. And you've got to remember, and I've got to remind myself of this all the time, high sensitivity only affects about 20% of any species population. So your likelihood of encountering it in an animal, unless you've got a specific soul contract to keep company with a wide variety of highly sensitive animals, like I seem to have. And we discussed soul contracts in earlier episodes of this season of Let's Talk to Animals. So I highly encourage you to go back and listen or re-listen to some of those episodes, and certainly send me questions if you have any questions about that. But those are resource articles if you want to learn a little bit more about what I mean by a soul pet and a soul contract with a companion animal. But for most of us, if we keep company with 10 animals over our lifetime, that means maybe approximately one or two of them may possess the trait of high sensitivity. And another, like a little footnote, is that the trait of high sensitivity in and of itself can also fluctuate in terms of intensity. We have folks that they're pretty happy in their own company all the time. Maybe the nature of their work or the relationships that they have in place or their responsibilities really lends itself to that solitary lifestyle. We have others who are maybe kind of a little bit more in the middle. Maybe some things are more tolerable than others. Maybe loud sounds are intolerable, but bright lights don't bother them. And that may have a link into some trauma or some experiences that they've had in their life. And that is adaptation at work, coding into our fight, flight, freeze, tend, or befriend survival system, what to watch out for in the future based on what has unfolded in the past. And so we also have to be a little careful about not typecasting the highly sensitive pet or the highly sensitive person. So it's all about nuances. And this is where developing your intuitive abilities, awakening, turning on, flipping the switch on your intuitive pathways, a sensory pathway, just our regular five senses in the second iteration, if you will. And we're just taking them for a test drive in their intuitive form. And we're starting to become comfortable with our own gut instincts and aha moments and our vibes, as my teacher Sonia Choquette loves to say, our vibes. She has this analogy about green light vibes, yellow light vibes, and red light vibes, and understanding how to work with each. But it starts with understanding that they're there and learning how to recognize them, and then how to work with them step by step to receive kind of an inner GPS system that's a heck of a lot more timely, present focused, interactive, and helpful than just piloting our lives by our regular gross physical senses alone. This is where it becomes really helpful to start really awakening and unfolding those abilities, because it allows us to sense into what's going on within us and also what's going on around us and what's going on with the other individuals that we keep company with and we share our lives with. So now let's take a look a little bit more closely at how to work with, how to support, and how to love a highly sensitive pet exactly the way that they are, and how to help them better navigate their environment and their world and get their needs met and kind of avoid some of the overwhelm that can quite naturally occur for a highly sensitive being of any species, including our own. And especially recognizing that our companion animals, even if you've got an animal communicator in the family like we do in ours, our pets, whether highly sensitive or not, are still taxed with living in our world by our rules, according to our expectations and assumptions, and really having very limited ability to communicate to us on a moment by moment basis exactly what's going on for them. Even for me, there's one of me, and I'm caring for my mom and also 4 animals, and all 4 have the trait of high sensitivity to some degree. And so when you consider that, if you divide me 5 ways, anybody, even if I don't factor in any time for myself, I'm still only able to really connect in with each family member about 20% of the time. So we have to kind of recognize what our highly sensitive animals are up against just getting through to us, let alone creating a life environment, a habitat, a schedule that plays to their strengths and avoids triggering their trait unnecessarily and sending them into overdrive or overload or full-on retreat. So the first thing that a highly sensitive pet is going to need from their pet parent, and if that happens to be you, I can speak to what my highly sensitive pets need from me, is awareness. My highly sensitive pets need my empathy. They need my awareness that they are highly sensitive, and that is a 24/7 experience for them. That is not something they can turn on and off. It's not like my social extroversion, where I'm introverted by nature. But as I've gotten older and more experienced through the decades, I've learned to manage that trait to where if I know I've got a period of time coming up where I'm going to be kind of more full on, it's going to be louder, it's going to be jam packed with people, maybe I'm going to be in the hot seat or in the spotlight, I can kind of work with myself and plan for that and pad in some extra time and space before and after. So I can kind of plan for those periods and get myself through it. But the trait of high sensitivity is 24/7. There is no off switch. So we want to do our best not to put so many constraints on our lifestyle or situation that we don't meet our own needs. We don't meet the needs of our other family members of any species, over controlling the environment to make sure that the highly sensitive pet isn't overstimulated, but they need certain basic safeguards. And this includes an area in the home and or yard or wherever they're staying where they can be completely alone and they are shielded to a great degree from the sensory experiences that can cause overload so easily, which is extreme heat or cold, extremely bright lights, loud sounds. And this includes, especially for our ground dwelling animals, this includes vibrations and low sounds. So if you're somebody who lives in a neighborhood where there's a lot of loud music going on, I have been there, I've lived in those neighborhoods, and there's a lot of subterranean bass rumble. Right now, we've got a huge commercial construction project going on behind our house, and there is a lot of subterranean vibration, a lot of very low frequency, very disturbing sounds. And my tortoise, Malty, is very disturbed by the low subterranean sounds and the rumbles and the vibrations of the trucks and the huge forklifts and the cranes. And so I've got to be very mindful. And sometimes she'll be out for half the day and then she'll just come charging up the dog ramp and wait by the back door. And she goes right into her she shed. And she just goes into the dark and she crawls under her big stuffed sea turtle and she just decompresses there. And we've set it up so that she has an easy system when she lets me know when she's ready to come in. And I'm aware of what's going on. And I check periodically, is she ready? Is she at the back door? Does she want to come in? So we just have developed the kind of the system to get through this period when they're doing all this construction. For highly sensitive animals, even drafts, the air conditioning or the heat coming on or going off can cause rumbles and sonics in the house, as well as just the experience of having hot air or cold air blowing on you and not being able to get away from it. So anything we can do to kind of make sure that there's at least one area in the home, and also that this area is someplace where every other family pet can't crawl in there with them. It really is built for one. It's kind of like a little safe house, a little safe area where they can just kind of go and be by themselves. And then the next thing comes back to our awareness again, that when they go there, we don't immediately go and try to drag them out, even if it's their dinner time, unless there's a vet visit or something urgent that needs to happen. When they go in there, we respect that and we leave them. We leave them be. Maybe we can bring their food and their water in there with them and let them have it at their leisure, but we respect their need to decompress and just be by themselves. And then when we're planning our own lives, again, it's not that we want to be tiptoeing around the highly sensitive pet to the point where everything has to be for them and about them, but we just kind of try to set up our lives. If you're going to have a gathering in the house, we make sure that it doesn't take place in that animal safe space, which this can take some advanced planning, especially if you live in chronically small spaces like I do, but you just kind of start to think through it in advance, just making sure that they always have a place to retreat to. The second thing that can be so important is just monitoring the smells, the aromas in the house. And this can include us. If you're a pet parent like me who loves essential oils, you love fragrances, you love things to smell great, incense, candles, all kind of things, just recognizing that your highly sensitive pet probably doesn't. And for me, I mean, when I say I love incense, I mean like I might burn a tiny little bit of it, definitely away from where my animals are. So it's like I've known people that will burn like 3 incense sticks simultaneously while they're meditating. I could never deal with that. So we're talking just a tiny little bit. And for me, that may be okay. For my animals that are highly sensitive, that's like complete overload, just a tiny little bit, and it may not even be safe. So I'm very mindful when I use my essential oils, when I burn my incense, when I do my smudging or my saging, making sure the windows are open, making sure my animals are somewhere else, just making sure that I am not an overwhelming aroma to them and making sure that they are not exposed to any overwhelming aromas. Even cooking, you may be somebody who loves very fragrant foods and loves to cook with onions or garlic or something else that is just highly fragrant, and just making sure that your animals have a way to get away from that especially if they're highly sensitive, because they may not experience that as something positive at all. And when it comes to their food, the trait of high sensitivity for me and for my animals also tends to dovetail quite nicely with the trait of needing a daily routine that is pretty much something they can count on. And so when playing with their food, there can be so many reasons you want to vary the diet, but just playing with the food so it's not too intensely sweet or savory for them, even if you're adding herbs. The more that we've learned about zoopharmacognosy, the more we're starting to realize how vitally important certain herbs and botanicals and different supplements can be. Just even supplementing our organic foods, recognizing that even eating organic, we're probably eating foods grown in depleted soils. And so sometimes we need to supplement, especially if there's a health issue going on, but just recognizing a little goes a long way. We start at the base minimum. And especially if there's going to be a strong flavor, a strong aroma associated with that, just being very mindful that blander tends to be better it's just not always the case, but blander tends to be better for the highly sensitive pet. Even if it's very savory or more sweet, it's just working with the seasons, working with what that animal is used to, and working with the very lowest possible amount until we see how our animal reacts. And that's just good common sense too, but especially for a highly sensitive animal, if anything's changed, they're going to notice. You can just count on it. And so you just want to go on the assumption that less is more until you see how they respond. Another thing that you can do to really support your highly sensitive pet is just be very mindful of how you interact with them physically. Just being mindful that what might be very intensely wonderful and welcome from a non-highly sensitive pet, for a highly sensitive pet, a little pat can go a long way. And there are ways you can work with that, getting the animal used to it. It may be that initially they're very shy of that. They're very hesitant to welcome too much physical contact, but over time, they may decide that it's okay coming from you. But then there's also an energetic and an emotional component to that. And this is where being highly intuitive and starting to really wake up those pathways can really serve you here, because you don't want to be bringing all your own neediness and all your own expectation to the table. It's like, well, I need to pet you. I need to snuggle you. I need to cuddle you. And of course we do. They're so cute. But when we bring all that with us, then we're adding on an intensity of experience on multiple levels at once. And our highly sensitive pet is going to pick up on that. And their fight, flight, freeze, tender, befriend system is going to process it and issue the single advice: run. So if you're coming to your highly sensitive pet and you're wanting to cuddle, you're wanting to snuggle, you're wanting to pet them or just sit with them, small moves and slow, and not in moments where you're feeling overwhelmed or intensely emotional or needy yourself. And that can be really hard when here you are and your animal is your companion and you need them and you want them, and they can't really be there for you necessarily in that way, at least not at first. But here, being sensitive to what they can tolerate and what they need, that can open them up over time, and you may be able to get there with them. But you just, again, it's about small moves and starting with real respect for how they process life and how they can't turn that off. We really default to our mind, to words, to thoughts. Our animals mostly communicate in pictures and sensation, emotion, sensory data, visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory. They very grounded in the sensory, and whereas we tend to be very grounded and sometimes stuck in the intellectual. When you've got a mental picture of something that you want or need or expect that will translate to your animal. Your animal is going to pick that up. And so if you're coming to a highly sensitive pet with, you need to be this way because this is how dogs or cats or birds are, that's going to come across in a very negative way and overwhelm your highly sensitive pet. Again, it's about love languages. I chose the name Animal Love Languages for my practice for a reason, because when we really, really love someone, we go the extra mile to notice what they want, what they need, what makes them happy. We learn to speak their love language and offer them that gift, that priceless gift that so many of us crave and so few of us actually feel like we really receive. I mean, how many beings of any species in your lifetime can you count? Do you feel that they really learned your love language? What makes you tick? What makes your heart sing? What lights you up? And did more of that. It's like Dolly Parton says, figure out who you are and then do it on purpose. And the incredible part is when we really love somebody, we do that for ourselves first, and then we do that for them by getting curious, wondering, asking questions, noticing, doing more of what lights them up and far less of what seems to provoke the opposite. The more that you welcome your highly sensitive animal just the way they are, and with curiosity and wonder, and with the opportunity, the priceless gift of learning a new way, you may find that some of the things that work well for your highly sensitive pet also work really well for you. And there's that soul contract piece again, where you may discover this highly sensitive pet is in my life because I've been ignoring or judging or shaming or trying to divorce myself from certain aspects of my own personality or my own needs. I've let people run roughshod over me or railroad over me. I've tolerated people or situations or activities or experiences that are really hard for me to deal with and recover from. And so it could very well be that if you have attracted a highly sensitive pet into your world and you have a significant relationship, it could be that there's some mirroring and some modeling going on. Mirroring, of course, is showing you an aspect in yourself that it would be hard for you to recognize and own otherwise. And modeling is expressing, acting out in front of you a positive way to deal with that, or sometimes the negative aspects of not dealing with it, and then a positive way of dealing with that. I have a tool on my website called Why You Pick Me. That's under free tools on my website under Learn With Me, and you can learn what certain species tend to be in our lives to teach us. So far, I've got dogs, cats, birds, horses, and reptiles represented, but there also are subtler nuances of what is a highly sensitive animal in my life to teach me, not just about themselves and other highly sensitive people, but about me. Maybe there's some of that trait in me too, or maybe there is something that experiencing this trait up close and personal has to offer me that will help unfold me and evolve me and get me closer to my goals. Maybe it'll teach me how to be more appropriately with other highly sensitive people in my workplace or in my significant relationships. It's really going to take our connection to a new level. So there's all kinds of opportunities, and it starts with loving this animal who is wired a little differently and loving them and accepting them just the way they are, and then even altering how we are with them and how even aspects of how we are in our world to help them shine and feel comfortable and feel like they fit in quite naturally. They have to make less effort to adapt or change aspects of themselves, and just here, let me help you with that. Let me create a kinder, softer, safer, sweeter world for you to live in and for us to share in together. That's what I have to share with you today about highly sensitive pets, about the trait of high sensitivity in our companion animals, how it tends to show up in them, some assumptions or misconceptions that we have about what's really going on, how to find out from your animal what's really going on, what percentage may be attributed to high sensitivity versus trauma or injury or illness or some other aspect, what you can offer your highly sensitive animal to give them a more relaxing and supportive and joyful and loving experience of daily life in your interspecies family, and also perhaps some soul lessons that this trait of high sensitivity comes bearing gifts for all of us. And if you have more questions about the trait of high sensitivity, please do reach out, post a comment, or send me an email, Shannon@animallovelanguages.com. I also have a special highly sensitive pet help guide on the animallovelanguages.com website. Head over to Learn With Me, free tools, and it will pop right up and you can order your free guide. It's got the highly sensitive pet quiz in it to see if you can kind of identify whether your animal may perhaps have the trait. It's got some links to research on highly sensitive people, and there's a questionnaire for highly sensitive dogs that you can kind of extrapolate for your animal species. And as more research becomes available, of course, I will add that as well. Some blog posts that I've written, definitely this podcast episode will be in it, but also some other resources that I have shared that you may find helpful. And of course, you can always reach out to me for an animal communication session so you and your highly sensitive pet can have a productive conversation about what works best for you both and how to experience maximum closeness and mutual trust with a minimum of impact to either one of you from the highly sensitive traits. So I hope that this podcast has been helpful and supportive to you and your whole family. Please do all the things like subscribe. Most importantly, share. If you have a friend or a family who may be caring for a highly sensitive pet, may need a little extra support, this podcast is a wonderful free gift. You can find all of our episodes at letstalktoanimals.buzzsprout.com, over on YouTube at Shannon Cutts under Animal Communication Talks, and the brand new shiny YouTube podcast tab. And you can find us at animallovelanguages.com/podcast for all the episodes, all 4 seasons. Okay. Sending you all my love from my highly sensitive family to you and your interspecies family. Look forward to welcoming you back in a couple weeks for our next episode of Let's Talk to Animals. Okay, all my love. Bye for now.